Europe has quietly crossed the U.S. off its list of main agricultural partners. Nearly $4 billion worth of American beef and soybeans has been rejected. Not because of disease, not because of quality issues, but because of President Trump's own tariff policies. Meanwhile, Canada, a country the U.S. once dismissed as soft, has been chosen by the EU as its replacement supplier. This move hasn't just left thousands of U.S. containers stranded. It's driven farmers into losses, sent domestic prices skyrocketing, and, most alarming of all, threatens to strip America of its status as a global food superpower. The question now is Trump isolating the U.S. in its own backyard? And if Europe has turned its back, who's next? If you find this video important, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because what happens next could directly impact your family's dinner table. When Europe joins hands with Canada to push back against America. The summer of 2025 is witnessing a major turning point in global agricultural trade. And the U.S. is the side losing the most. The trade deal between the U.S. and the EU, which had already been strained since late 2024, is now on the brink of complete collapse as the August 1st deadline approaches, with no concessions coming from Washington. President Trump, as he had previously done with Canada, imposed a sweeping tariff schedule on the EU of up to 30% on imports, with agricultural goods taking the hardest hit. The situation worsened when the EU not only rejected Washington's new negotiating terms, but also actively sought out a replacement partner. And they found it in Canada. In less than 2 months, Brussels signed a flurry of fast-track contracts to import beef and soybeans from Ottawa, estimated at more than $3.9 billion for the 2025-2026 period. These are the very products that once made up nearly 40% of U.S. agricultural exports to the EU. Europe's decision wasn't emotional, it was a strategic calculation. On one hand, tariffs between the EU and Canada under the CETA agreement remain significantly lower than those with the U.S., especially now that America has tripled its own rates. On the other hand, Canadian beef and soybeans are seen as stable, reliable, and environmentally friendly, aligning with the EU's strict standards on growth hormones, carbon footprint, and antibiotic controls. This shift isn't just about trade, it's a clear political message. The EU has grown tired of Washington's inconsistency and its strong-arm approach to trade policy. Instead, they're choosing to work with a partner they believe won't wield tariffs as a negotiation weapon. And America, what was once its greatest strength. Massive supply, competitive pricing, is now being left behind because of a lack of trust. And as Europe turns away billions of dollars worth of U.S. agricultural goods are left with nowhere to go. The devastating consequences for American agriculture. When a massive market like Europe suddenly shuts its doors, the first to feel the pain aren't officials in Washington. It's the farmers in the Midwest, where millions of tons of soybeans and beef are now piling up in cold storage facilities, shipping ports, and processing plants. Iowa, Texas, Nebraska, states once proud to call themselves the breadbasket feeding the world, are now staring down a crippling consumption crisis. In the past, the U.S. exported roughly 1.5 million tons of soybeans to the EU each year, along with hundreds of thousands of tons of beef, providing steady revenue streams for tens of thousands of farms. Long-term contracts, predictable cash flow, a smooth-running supply chain. But once the EU pivoted to Canada, every link in that chain started to snap. The soybeans have no buyers. Beef is sitting in oversupply. Prices have collapsed. Farmers feel handcuffed because you can't just rip out soy fields and plant corn or rice overnight. In a small town in eastern Kansas, a beef processing plant had to halt operations after European contracts, which made up 60% of its revenue. Vanished. More than 300 workers saw their hours cut, and some were laid off entirely. The neighboring cattle ranch suddenly had nowhere to send its livestock and was forced to dump fully grown cattle for barely half the price they fetched earlier this year. The same story is unfolding across soybean-heavy states like Illinois and Indiana. Storage bins are bursting. Containers once destined for export are being rerouted back into the domestic market, where supply has already crushed demand. Soybean prices at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange have plunged more than 18% in just 6 weeks. For many farmers, this isn't just a financial blow. It's a hit to their faith and trust in the very government they supported. America First was a policy they once backed wholeheartedly, believing it would shield domestic agriculture. But what they got instead wasn't protection. It was isolation. As the world turns to more reliable partners, America has locked itself in a vicious cycle of tariff decisions with no exit plan. And now a painful question echoes across the countryside. Who do we sell to now? And tragically, the government doesn't have a single convincing answer. American consumers take the hit. Higher prices, fewer choices. When exports grind to a halt, the first thing Americans feel isn't the emptiness at the ports. It's the price tags in the supermarket aisles. Europe's sudden withdrawal from multi-billion-dollar contracts didn't just hurt farmers. It triggered a chain reaction that hit U.S. consumers head-on. Rising prices, a warped supply flow, and fewer choices on the shelves. Start with beef, the staple that shows up on dinner tables in tens of millions of homes every week. With processors unable to ship to Europe, hundreds of thousands of tons of beef are stuck in the U.S. At first glance, you'd think that would bring prices down. The opposite happened. Costs for cold storage, packaging, and transporting that backlog skyrocketed. Supermarket chains like Kroger and Albertsons were forced to raise prices to cover the storage burden and spoilage risk. In the Northeast, the price of a pound of mid-grade beef has jumped 17% in just 2 months. For low-income families, a protein-rich meal is becoming a luxury. Soybeans and related products, soy milk, cooking oil, plant-based foods are in the same bind. With millions of bushels boomeranging back into the domestic market, prices didn't drop. Processing costs climbed as storage yards overflowed and supply chains snarled. Many small processing plants simply couldn't afford long-term holding costs and shut down, creating sudden shortages in states like Michigan and Missouri. And driving prices higher. And what about the consumer? They're not just paying more, they're staring at a shrinking market. A Dallas grocery store that once stocked 7 brands of packaged soybeans now carries 3. Organic and premium lines, once produced for export, are no longer prioritized because there's no budget to restructure domestic distribution. What's left are cheaper, lower quality options, even as prices keep rising. Americans now face a strange paradox: surpluses of farm goods, yet climbing prices. Why? Because the supply chain was built for exports. When overseas markets collapse, the system can't pivot fast enough for domestic needs. That lag leaves dangerous gaps, where supply is misaligned and the consumer pays the price. The ripple effects spread further. Higher feed costs push up the price of eggs, milk, and poultry. Diners and budget restaurants cut menu items, raise plate prices, or switch to lower-grade ingredients. This is a domino chain. Consumers tighten, spending producers lose revenue, and the whole market grinds into a chokehold. The hardest hit middle-aged workers, retirees, and those on fixed incomes. Already battered by years of inflation, now they face costlier groceries, fewer choices, and the creeping fear that everything they once relied on is vanishing from shelves. For those with medical conditions who need strict diets, high-protein, low-fat, or non-GMO soy, the options are almost gone. Premium brands once destined for Europe can't afford to keep separate production lines for the US, and are blending everything together, lowering standards in the process. Meanwhile, rural communities are hit with a double blow. They're the producers who can't sell their goods, and the consumers paying extra for food because of soaring transport costs. Small towns that depend on local markets or distribution hubs now face the grim reality of can't sell, can't buy. What we're seeing is an upside-down consumer economy, no longer driven by buyer choice but warped by policy chaos, broken supply chains, and lost international trust. The scariest part: there is no quick fix. If Washington can't reach a new deal with the EU, and if other partners hesitate to step into a politically unstable market, Americans will keep living with expensive, less nutritious, lower quality food. And when that day comes, we'll realize that a single tweet, a single tariff declaration, meant to target someone else, is really making American families pay for it at every meal. And America losing its power, and its people losing control of their plates. America was once the food empire, not only feeding itself, but feeding the world. From the endless soybean fields of the Midwest to sprawling cattle ranches across Texas, U.S. agriculture stood for quality, scale, and dominance on the global stage. But today we're witnessing something unprecedented: America's food power slipping into the hands of others. while Americans themselves are losing control over what ends up on their plates. Europe's withdrawal isn't just a commercial blow, it's a cold, calculated message to the rest of the world. The US is no longer a reliable supplier. And when the EU chose Canada over the US, it wasn't just about losing contracts. It was about losing market share, losing political influence, and losing the chance to set the global standards for food. If Canada holds this new position, then within 5 years, international summits on food safety, climate change, and supply chains may no longer have America at the head of the table. And at home, Americans are facing an uncomfortable reality: they can no longer choose their meals the way they once could. Not long ago, you could pick between organic beef, hormone-free cuts, or non-GMO soy. Now, most of those premium products have vanished, too costly to maintain in a broken system. Consumers are being forced to buy whatever's left, or pay double to cling to the choices they used to take for granted. What's worse, the power of choice, once in the hands of consumers, is being replaced by the fallout of policy. It's no longer about what do you want to eat, but what's even available, dictated by the disarray of a nation that's losing its grip on its own market. And if this trend continues, the America that once symbolized abundance, variety, and control will find itself living like the very countries that used to depend on it, reactive, short-supplied, and painfully vulnerable. A question for America First: who's really being protected? When the slogan "America First" was shouted from the White House, many Americans, especially the working class and farmers, placed their full trust in it. They hoped it would truly safeguard domestic production, push back against foreign manipulation, and open a new era for the United States. But after everything that's happened, a bitter question is echoing in the very communities that once supported it most. Who's really being protected? If America First means throwing up tariff walls on every border, then the outcome is clear. Americans themselves are bearing the brunt first. Farmers are losing markets. Workers are getting laid off. Consumers are paying more for less food. Meanwhile, countries like Canada, once hammered with heavy tariffs, are emerging as winners as Europe turns to them for trade. We have to ask, does this policy truly make America stronger? Or is it just driving allies away while giving rivals the chance to form new alliances that replace America's role in the global supply chain? A nation cannot truly put itself first when its own agriculture is being strangled by decisions made at home. It can't claim to be a superpower when its own citizens are losing the ability to choose what's on their dinner tables. In the end, the most troubling part isn't a flawed policy. It's the stubborn refusal to acknowledge the damage. Because if America First doesn't come with responsibility and timely course correction, what's left isn't a strategy, just a slogan. When an agricultural superpower like the US is pushed out of trade talks, when farmers are left with nowhere to sell, and when everyday people are forced to pay more for less, that's not just the result of bad policy. It's the sign of a nation losing its footing from within. In today's globalized world, no country can act unilaterally without paying the price. And in this story, that price isn't being paid by policymakers in Washington. It's being paid by ordinary Americans, farmers, workers, and the shoppers filling their carts every single day.
This video does not promote division within the United States or encourage segregation. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and fostering discussion based on current events, public sentiment, and social trends. We fully respect the United States Constitution and all federal regulations. If today's analysis made you think, drop a comment so we can keep the conversations going. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you will never miss our next independent deep dive.